Section 17 of Confessions, volumes 5 and 6. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions, volumes 5 and 6, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, anonymously translated. Section 17. We arrived at Valence to dinner, and according to our usual custom, passed the remainder of the day there. We lodged out of the city, at the St. James, an inn I shall never forget. After dinner, Madame de Larnage proposed a walk. She knew the Marquis was no walker. Consequently, this was an excellent plan for a tete-a-tete, which she was predetermined to make the most of. While we were walking around the city, by the side of the moats, I entered on a long history of my complaint, to which she answered in so tender an accent, frequently pressing my arm, which she held to her heart, that it required all my stupidity not to be convinced of the sincerity of her attachment. I have already observed that she was amiable. Love rendered her charming, adding all the loveliness of youth, and she managed her advances with so much art that they were sufficient to have seduced the most insensible. I was therefore in very uneasy circumstances, and frequently on the point of making a declaration. But the dread of offending her, and the still greater of being laughed at, ridiculed, made table talk, and complimented on my enterprise by the satirical Marquis, had such unconquerable power over me, that though ashamed of my ridiculous bashfulness, I could not take courage to surmount it. I had ended the history of my complaints, which I felt the ridiculousness of at this time, and not knowing how to look or what to say, continued silent, giving the finest opportunity in the world for that ridicule I so much dreaded. Happily, Madame de Larnage took a more favorable resolution, and suddenly interrupted this silence by throwing her arms round my neck, while at the same instant her lips spoke too plainly on mine to be any longer misunderstood. This was reposing that confidence in me, the want of which has almost always prevented me from appearing myself. For once I was at ease, my heart, eyes, and tongue spoke freely what I felt. Never did I make better reparation for my mistakes, and if this little conquest had cost Madame de Larnage some difficulties, I have reason to believe she did not regret them. Was I to live 100 years, I should never forget this charming woman. I say charming, for though neither young nor beautiful, she was neither old nor ugly, having nothing in her appearance that could prevent her wit and accomplishments from producing all their effects. It was possible to see her without falling in love, but those she favored could not fail to adore her, which proves, in my opinion, that she was not generally so prodigal of her favors. It is true, her inclination for me was so sudden and lively, that it scarce appears excusable; though from the short but charming interval I passed with her, I have reason to think her heart was more influenced than her passions. Our good intelligence did not escape the penetration of the Marquis. Not that he discontinued his usual raillery; on the contrary, he treated me as a sighing, hopeless swain, languishing under the rigors of his mistress. Not a word, smile, or look escaped him by which I could imagine he suspected my happiness; and I should have thought him completely deceived, had not Madame de Larnage, who was more clear sighted than myself, assured me of the contrary. But he was a well bred man, and it was impossible to behave with more attention or greater civility than he constantly paid me, notwithstanding his satirical sallies, especially after my success, which, as he was unacquainted with my stupidity, he perhaps gave me the honor of achieving. It has already been seen that he was mistaken in this particular, but no matter, I profited by his error; for being conscious that the laugh was on my side, I took all his sallies in good part, and sometimes parried them with tolerable success. For proud of the reputation of wit which Madame de Larnage had thought fit to discover in me, I no longer appeared the same man. We were both in a country and season of plenty, and had everywhere excellent cheer, thanks to the good cares of the Marquis, though I would willingly have relinquished this advantage to have been more satisfied with the situation of our chambers; but he always sent his footman on to provide them, and whether of his own accord, or by the order of his master, the rogue always took care that the Marquis's chamber should be close by Madame de Larnage's, while mine was at the further end of the house. But that made no great difference, or perhaps it rendered our rendezvous the more charming. This happiness lasted 4 or 5 days, during which time I was intoxicated with delight, which I tasted pure and serene, without any alloy, an advantage I could never boast before. And I may add, it is owing to Madame de Larnage that I did not go out of the world without having tasted real pleasure. If the sentiment I felt for her was not precisely love, it was at least a very tender return of what she testified for me. Our meetings were so delightful, that they possessed all the sweets of love, without that kind of delirium which affects the brain, and even tends to diminish our happiness. I never experienced true love but once in my life, and that was not with Madame de Larnage. Neither did I feel that affection for her which I had been sensible of, and yet continued to possess, for Madame de Warrens; but for this very reason our tete a tete were 100 times more delightful. When with Madame de Warrens, my felicity was always disturbed by a secret sadness, a compunction of heart, which I found it impossible to surmount. instead of being delighted at the acquisition of so much happiness, I could not help reproaching myself for contributing to render her I loved unworthy. On the contrary, with Madame de Larnage, I was proud of my happiness, and gave into it without repugnance, while my triumph redoubled every other charm. I do not recollect exactly where we quitted the Marquis, who resided in this country, but I know we were alone on our arrival at Montélimar, where Madame de Larnage made her chambermaid get into my chaise, and accommodate me with a seat in hers. It will easily be believed that travelling in this manner was by no means displeasing to me, and that I should be very much puzzled to give any account of the country we passed through. She had some business at Montélimar, which detained her there 2 or 3 days. During this time she quitted me but 1/4 of an hour, for a visit she could not avoid, which embarrassed her with a number of invitations she had no inclination to accept, and therefore excused herself by pleading some indisposition, though she took care this should not prevent our walking together every day in the most charming country, and under the finest sky imaginable. Oh, those 3 days! What reason have I to regret them? Never did such happiness return again. The amours of a journey cannot be very durable. It was necessary we should part, and I must confess it was almost time. Not that I was weary of my happiness, but I might as well have been. We endeavored to comfort each other for the pain of parting by forming plans for our reunion, and it was concluded that after staying 5 or 6 weeks at Montpellier, which would give Madame de Larnage time to prepare for my reception in such a manner as to prevent scandal, I should return to Saint Andiol, and spend the winter under her direction. She gave me ample instruction on what it was necessary I should know, on what it would be proper to say, and how I should conduct myself. She spoke much and earnestly on the care of my health, conjured me to consult skillful physicians, and be attentive and exact in following their prescriptions, whatever they might happen to be. I believe her concern was sincere, for she loved me, and gave proofs of her affection less equivocal than the prodigality of her favors. For judging by my mode of traveling that I was not in very affluent circumstances, though not rich herself, on our parting she would have had me share the contents of her purse, which she had brought pretty well furnished from Grenoble, and it was with great difficulty I could make her put up with a denial. In a word, we parted, my heart full of her idea, and leaving in hers, if I am not mistaken, a firm attachment to me. While pursuing the remainder of my journey, remembrance ran over everything that had passed from the commencement of it, and I was well satisfied at finding myself alone in a comfortable chaise, where I could ruminate at ease on the pleasures I had enjoyed, and those which awaited my return. I only thought of Saint Andiol, of the life I was to lead there, I saw nothing but Madame de Larnage, or what related to her. The whole universe besides was nothing to me. Even Madame de Warrens was forgotten. I set about combining all the details by which Madame de Larnage had endeavored to give me in advance an idea of her house, of the neighborhood, of her connections and manner of life, finding everything charming. She had a daughter, whom she had often described in the warmest terms of maternal affection. This daughter was 15, lively, charming, and of an amiable disposition. Madame de Larnage promised me her friendship. I had not forgotten that promise, and was curious to know how Mademoiselle de Larnage would treat her mother's bonne amie. These were the subjects of my reveries from the Pont du Saint-Esprit to Remoulins. I had been advised to visit the Pont du Gard. Hitherto I had seen none of the remaining monuments of Roman magnificence, and I expected to find this worthy the hands by which it was constructed. For once the reality surpassed my expectation. This was the only time in my life it ever did so, and the Romans alone could have produced that effect. The view of this noble and sublime work struck me the more forcibly from being in the midst of a desert, where silence and solitude render the majestic edifice more striking, and admiration more lively, for though called a bridge, it is nothing more than an aqueduct. One cannot help exclaiming, what strength could have transported these enormous stones so far from any quarry? And what motive could have united the labors of so many millions of men in a place that no one inhabited? I remained here whole hours in the most ravishing contemplation, and returned pensive and thoughtful to my inn. This reverie was by no means favorable to Madame de Larnage. She had taken care to forewarn me against the girls of Montpellier, but not against the Pont du Gard. It is impossible to provide for every contingency. On my arrival at Nismes, I went to see the amphitheatre, which is a far more magnificent work than even the Pont du Gard, yet it made a much less impression on me, perhaps because my admiration had been already exhausted on the former object, or that the situation of the latter, in the midst of a city, was less proper to excite it. This vast and superb circus is surrounded by small dirty houses, while yet smaller and dirtier fill up the area, in such a manner that the whole produces an unequal and confused effect, in which regret and indignation stifle pleasure and surprise. The amphitheatre at Verona is a vast deal smaller, and less beautiful than that at Nismes, but preserved with all possible care and neatness, by which means alone it made a much stronger and more agreeable impression on me. The French pay no regard to these things, respect no monument of antiquity. Ever eager to undertake, they never finish, nor preserve anything that is already finished to their hands. End of section 17. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.